I have not seen that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was going to ask you particularly about some of the stuff that's in here on his interfaith stuff is really absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, ask me about it. Ask me, because what I wanted to do today is I have one of his speeches that he gave. I liked our format last week where we went through one of his speeches. I think that's a good way to study Heschel. And so we're going to go through one of his speeches. But tell me, what were you thinking?
Well, the one that he's got is "No Religion is an Island."
Oh yeah.
And the commentary to that here is really pretty extensive. But some of the details that she brought out in terms of his life, his relationship with Martin Luther King was really extensive.
Incredibly extensive.
I mean, not only does he get King involved in the anti-war movement because he's head of the basically the group of pastors and clergy that's anti-war, but he actually gets about a week or two before King dies, he gives the birthday speech. He actually comes in to JTS to give the birthday speech for Heschel.
Yeah. Yeah. It's remarkable. They were not only friends, there was a deep mutual influence. King had a lot of supporters and friends in the Jewish community. Like, that's without doubt. And I think the Jewish community takes a lot of pride in that a lot of supporters, not only financial, but activists, many people in the Jewish community supported Martin Luther King and were active. But Heschel, it was a different level. It was a shaper, an influencer, and like a profound equality. In some ways, Martin Luther King looked to Heschel as like a teacher and an inspiration. King didn't have that relationship with many other people. Definitely not in the Jewish community. So I think that is a really, truly, and I think the respect was mutual. I think King looked to Heschel as like an Old Testament prophet in a way.
That's what he says.
Yeah.
In his birthday speech, he quotes him as being a prophet.
Yeah. And then I think Heschel saw King as a modern day prophet. Like, I think that the feeling was mutual, and a prophet, this is actually a very interesting educational opportunity, because what exactly is a prophet? That's a good, if I were to ask you, everyone on this call, in this class, what is a prophet? What would you say?
What, a biblical definition or a modern definition?
Both.
Well, biblical definition is, it's got to be, well, Maimonides is different, but a biblical definition is it's somebody who speaks, the direct message from God. Maimonides basically says you have to work your way up to it. Basically, you earn it. You earn your way up to get access. But from a modern perspective, prophet is really a much broader concept. It's because you can't apply it in the context of Deuteronomy chapter 13 of false prophets and following a prophet or otherwise die, from Deuteronomy chapter 18 and what have you. But the modern definition of a prophet is much broader. It's more metaphorical in a sense. It's somebody who just is an incredible visionary. In the metaphorical sense, is called a prophet in modern terms. So you don't have to actually have a direct line to God, so to speak, but your influence and your ideas have to be, on that level.
Yeah, excellent. What else? How would you answer what is a prophet? What's the definition of a prophet?
Sure.
Somebody will ask you that. Yeah.
I wouldn't give a definition of a prophet, but after last week's session with you, and I was thinking about what we were talking about, Heschel seemed so advanced. He was writing, I think it was the 1960s, you said?
Yeah, and 50s and 60s, yeah.
50s and 60s, about stuff that is really just being talked about now, in a way. And that to me is a prophet. And the things that we were talking about, that he just seems so advanced of his time and his ideas. And to me, a prophet is someone who is advanced in his ideas, and then society kind of slowly comes along and accepts them or looks at them.
Very much so. That's a great observation, right? So I guess what you're kind of saying is part of the definition or characteristics of a prophet is that they are ahead of their times. They are saying things that will eventually come to pass.
You said
Well,
it much better than I did.
Yeah, well, thank you. But also in some ways that's a little bit the biblical definition of a prophet. A prophet in biblical times was successful if their prophecy didn't come true. And this is a very interesting nuance here, because the purpose of a prophet like Jeremiah or Amos or Isaiah, or even, you think about the book of Micah, which we read on Yom Kippur, is he prophesies the destruction of Nineveh, and then the people of Nineveh repent and the destruction doesn't happen. He has been a successful prophet. A successful prophet gets people to change their behavior so that the prophecy doesn't come true. It's like a parent. It's like, you better act this way or you're, going to lose your car. Well, yeah, it's successful if they change their behavior. But in some ways, as you pointed out, and I think is true, in the modern world, we tend to think of a prophet as somebody who is a visionary and is ahead of can see what's going to happen in the future before it actually plays out. So like Heschell saw certain changes in society. I mean, you think the most successful business people, like a Steve Jobs, one could say a prophetic sensibility in that eventually people are going to be holding all the music in the world in their hand and a phone. I mean, it's not a religious type of prophecy, but it's a vision of what will come. And that's generally how we see prophecy today, which is a little bit different than how it's understood in the Hebrew Bible. Other definitions or insights into prophecy. Very complicated topic. There was a very famous essay written by a guy named Achad Ha'am. How many of you have heard of Achad Ha'am? Yeah, a few of you. So Achad Ha'am was a counterpart to Theodor Herzl. So Theodor Herzl was a political Zionist. Theodor Herzl focused his energies on building the Jewish state. Achad Ha'am was what we call a cultural Zionist. So he was interested in creating a Jewish cultural homeland. It didn't matter whether it was actually a political state like Israel with a Supreme Court and a legislature and so forth, or if it was, in another state where Jews had cultural freedom, like the United States in some ways. He was interested in the land of Israel, but he said a cultural revolution, in some ways, a cultural center is more important than a political center. Now, in an ideal world, we have both, but Achad Ha'am was focused on Israel as a cultural center. And he was very interested in Jewish culture in history. Now, he happened to grow up Orthodox, but became secular. And he wrote an essay. He wrote a lot of essays. His essays were very famous sort of documents of history. And his essay was called Priest and Prophet. And in this essay, he contrasted the roles of priest and prophet in Jewish history. And he said a priest is somebody who is generally very comfortable with the status quo. So a priest is somebody who officiates at the temple in Jerusalem. They're essentially part of the power structure of the culture. They and he would say, modern functionaries, like, people who like a rabbi, like a priestly function of a rabbi would be officiating at B'nai Mitzvah, funerals, weddings. Like that's what the ancient Israelite priests, they officiated over sacrifices, they said prayers, they were part of the regular order of society. The prophets were outsiders. They were people who didn't care what other people thought of what they said, but they spoke what was on their mind, whether it endeared them to those in power or whether it alienated people from power. And Ahad Ha'am had a very nuanced point where he said, you need both. You actually need both types of people. You need the priests, or else you have total anarchy and chaos. That if there isn't an orderly society, if we didn't know Shabbat was on Friday to Saturday, and that, a wedding happened this way, and there were speed limits and so forth, if we didn't have any type of order, you couldn't function. On the other hand, if all you have is order and the status quo, then nothing changes and it soon becomes dull and irrelevant. So you need prophecy. In some ways, Moses and Aaron represent those two different poles. You've got Moses, who's sort of a prophet, he can't control his temper. He says exactly what's on his mind. He shatters the tablets. And then you've got Aaron, who is more of a priest, right? And remember, Aaron is the father of the priesthood, who kind of goes along with the people, even when it's not the right thing to do, so you need both those roles. And it's a brilliant essay. So I forgot where I was going with this. Oh, it was about prophecy, that you actually had, that the prophet plays a critical role. And so I think Heschell, go back to Heschell saw himself as a prophet, and he saw Martin Luther King as a prophet. So these were people that were outside of the normal order. I mean, Heschell was a professor at JTS, so in some ways he is part of the order, but he wasn't, the other professors didn't like him. A lot of the students didn't like him. He was not a, now they take pride, in having Heschell, but at the time he was not, a celebrated professor. He was in many ways an outsider. He was even an outsider in America. He grew up in Warsaw, Poland, from this long Hasidic family, living in 1950s America. He's an outsider. And so he has this prophetic, and remember, when he opposed the Vietnam War, I think it's like 1964, 1965, it was overwhelmingly popular. It was not mainstream. And again, he was criticized by a lot of, same with Martin Luther King. They were criticized by a lot of other priests and rabbis. I mean, Martin Luther King was kicked out of the leadership of SNCC for a while because of his opposition to the Vietnam War. So this was a risk. And that is essentially what distinguishes a prophet from a priest: the willingness to go up against the establishment because of your views and to stick by them. And then ultimately, your views become the mainstream. What was once a total extreme becomes the standard. And that's essentially what happened with both King and Heschell. Although with King, it's even more interesting in that his views became mainstream, but then they quickly became outsider views again, because of Black power, and he was sort of seen as a moderate instead of an extremist after a while. I mean, the legacy of King is quite interesting. But okay. Any other questions about prophecy or priesthood?
So we look at prophets in liberal Judaism typically as social critics, right? They were the ones that took on the kings. They were the ones who took on, Amos and all this, justice and, all the great concepts are coming out of the prophets that we pick up on. So social critic, I guess, is one aspect of prophecy. What other kind of visionary aspects would you say are kind of part of the modern definition of prophecy?
Yeah, I think that speaking truth to power, but also prophets were intensely loyal. They were not critics for the sake of being critics. You know, we all probably know people who are critical, but they're not really invested in something. There's like, you know, it would be like, okay, this is probably not the best example, but it would be like a former member of a synagogue criticizing what the synagogue is doing. You know, like, well, you're not invested with us. You're like, you know, I thank you for telling me what's on your mind, but I really don't care. You know, I mean, you only, if you, prophets were invested in the people, their fate was tied in with the people that they were a part of. So there's a certain kind of commitment. You can't be, it's like, you can't be a backseat driver. You know, you got to be someone who is in the arena. That famous quote about being in the arena. So a prophet is in the arena. They're not criticizing you from the bleachers. That's one thing. Another thing is the prophets are loyal. I mean, that's sort of related, but they're part of the people. And the prophets are also, they're God's mouthpiece. They're not, the prophet is not about themselves. The prophet is about God. The prophets are serving as a mouthpiece for God, but their own particular personalities are somewhat irrelevant. Like Micah, for example. Micah, he doesn't want to go to Nineveh. He's lazy. He doesn't want to go. But God says, I don't care. You're the prophet, you're going, it doesn't matter. And then Micah is upset because his prophecy actually works. And God says, sorry, you were chosen to be a prophet. I don't care how it makes you feel. You know? So in some ways, a prophet has to have not very much self-regard. That's, you know, which is a strange way of putting it, but I think an accurate way of putting it. I mean, even Martin Luther King, you know, he kind of said, my life will, I mean, there's that famous speech he gave in Memphis before he died about, you know, I don't care if God takes me now. You know, there is a certain kind of subordinating one's life to a larger mission that is a characteristic of a prophet.
Yeah, what I was going to say,
Yeah.
Rabbi, is that following what you're saying, I think it's, in modern terms for me, it's somebody with a vision saying we could all be in a better place in the broadest sense of that word. And the prophecy is the fact that that person believes it's achievable and has a vision of what it would be like.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. A prophet cannot be a nihilist. A prophet cannot be somebody who just criticizes. There actually has to be a positive vision, you know, at the end, there has to be an underlying purpose to their criticism. So I think that's a very important. This, by the way, is why the prophets are somewhat messianic, not as in Messianic Judaism with Jews for Jesus. No. They actually have a vision of a Messiah. They're saying, we have to return to God's ways so that we can usher in the Messianic age, an age of, like Micah, you know, every man shall sit under their vines and fig trees, and none shall make them afraid. The word of God shall go out from Jerusalem. You know, so there is a kind of vision of a better world, of a perfect world for some of the prophets. That's a very important distinction. You cannot be a pessimist and also be, well, I guess you could be pessimistic in the short term, but you can't be a total nihilist and say that there's no purpose. You know, a prophet can't say God is dead. That's just That's surrender. That's giving up. That's not prophecy. Excellent point. It's nuanced.
Verified. Law office, Zoom, phone.
I couldn't hear you. What was that? Did somebody, I thought I just heard something. Okay. Well, any other questions about prophecy? Okay. Let's look at this speech. I'm going to pull it up here and share my screen. Hold on here. Okay. Share screen. Let's see where, here it is. Oh, this is so brilliant. This is so brilliant. This is on prayer. Where there's a couple sections I want to go to. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Here we go. Okay. This is a speech that he gave to the conservative movement, the conservative rabbis in 1953. So this is early Heschell. This is partly why I like it. We got a little bit of late Heschell last week. We have developed the habit of praying by proxy. Isn't that a great? Many congregants seem to have adopted the principle of vicarious prayer. The rabbi or the cantor does the praying for the congregation. In particular, it is the organ that does the singing for the whole community. Too often, the organ has become the shaliach tzibor. Indeed, when the organ begins to thunder, who can compete with its songs? Men and women are not allowed to raise their voices unless the rabbi issues a signal. They have come to regard the rabbi as a master of ceremonies. It's true. Is not their mood in part a reflection of our own uncertainty? Prayer has become an empty gesture, a figure of speech, either because of the lack of faith or because of religious bashfulness. We would not admit that we take prayer seriously. It would sound sanctimonious, if not hypocritical. We are too sophisticated. But if prayer is as important as study, if prayer is as precious as a deed as an act of charity, we must stop being embarrassed at our saying a bracha with kavanah. What do you think he's saying here? That's pretty clear, but what are your reactions to this? Anything?
I have a strong reaction to it. This is Jeffrey. As Joan and I moved here and went to different synagogues before we happily found Macomb, and even in prior cities, we found in many synagogues, there was very rarely did the congregation sing with the cantor. And in fact, many people would tell us, well, you have to go to this synagogue. The cantor has this beautiful voice, and we would go. And at least I personally would feel like I was at a concert.
Yeah.
And I would feel, yes, I'm hearing beautiful music, but I'm not getting moved in the way I want to be moved in the synagogue. And however you may define prayer and what you're singing, to me, there's a huge difference when I am singing quietly, because I don't have a good voice, but still singing and feeling the melodies, feeling what for me sometimes is the traditional feeling that goes with it, makes just a huge difference. And to me, it's totally different than what I'm sitting here hearing the best cantor with the best voice or the best musician. That's still a good experience, but it's not a religious experience.
It's great.
For me.
It's a great observation. Great observation. So it's essentially prayer as performance versus prayer as participation. And that in many ways, classical Reform Judaism was about prayer as performance, and that you had a really top-notch cantor, which we have even, but you have like the equivalent of an opera singer, and they're doing arias, and you appreciate the beauty of it, and that's that. Versus, singing along, even if you don't sing all that well. Yeah, that's great. Diane?
I think of this being more true in Reform synagogues and in conservative for sure. Let me just hang this up real quick. I think I can. Oh, Does that stop it? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I don't know how to take the volume down. So the volume's off and it's still ringing.
That's okay.
Okay. So I think of this being true in the Reform congregation. And even though people join in, I have always, I was raised in a conservative congregation, and I've always, when I'm in the congregation, I always sing with the choir, now that I'm not part of it again, and before I joined, and I sing anything I know, I join in always. And I can't begin to tell you how many people have turned around and said how nice it was to listen, because there'd be nobody else many times participating. And I think that one of the things that differentiates Saturday morning minyan from Friday night services, and certainly I don't mean to put down Friday night services because I know they're beautiful, but the fact is that it's totally praying. However, whatever time we spend there, we are in prayer, and people are joining in, and they're not being entertained, so to speak, by the. So I think it's something within the Reform movement that has to be thought about a little bit more, and I guess
That's a great point. Why do you think, I have my own thoughts, but why do you think it's particularly true in the Reform movement?
Well, because if you go to a conservative synagogue, I find that, when I'm there, whether it's a bar mitzvah or whatever it is, that the congregants are praying, other than when kids are walking in and out there, a bit of a disturbance, but that they're actually, they're praying more than I find in, and there's obviously I belong to Macomb because I love the synagogue, and I feel, that Reform Judaism is more right for me now than conservative. But I do think that there's a lot more participation in prayer than in a Reform synagogue. And
I think you're right. I think, well, it depends on the particular conservative synagogue, but I think some of it just is simply history, tradition, and education. So in many ways, the Reform service, people just don't know how to participate sometimes. That's part of the problem, that they're in a traditional service, which you would have in a conservative and Orthodox, there is a customary order of prayer and tunes that most people use. So if you're used to Orthodoxy, you can go into a conservative synagogue and feel pretty comfortable. If you grow up in a conservative synagogue, you can typically go into an Orthodox synagogue and feel somewhat comfortable, not 100%, especially if you're a female, but you can at least follow along. Whereas most Reform synagogues are pretty different, and they're different tunes. And of course, there are some prayers that are the same, the Shema and the Kaddish, but there's not a sort of consistent liturgy that somebody has to master. I remember the first time when I was in college and I went to the conservative minyan, and I was like, what are they doing? I couldn't follow. The closest I remember is like when I was a kid and would go to some bar mitzvahs that were conservative, which was rare. Almost all my friends belonged to Reform synagogue, just where I lived. But I think it can be jarring for certain Reform Jews who don't have the knowledge, to then being in a prayer setting. You just say, I'll just let, the rabbis, the professionals do it. Yeah. And I think for a lot of history, many Reform synagogues and rabbis encouraged that point of view. Even the architecture. Look at look at synagogues like KAM with the, the pulpit up high and a kind of separation between the congregation and the clergy. And so it kind of created that distance. Whereas like we would hope that that distance isn't encouraged. Yeah. Any other reactions? Yeah, Neil?
Yeah, I'm struggling to unmute myself.
That's
here.
okay.
Yeah, sorry, I'm old. As for the architecture, whenever I bring a Christian friend to services, especially if they're Lutheran, I always point out how much at home they're going to be. You can correct me on this, but I think much of Reformed Judaism was modeled after the Reformation of the German church, which would be the Lutheran church. And if you've ever been into a modern Lutheran church, it looks amazingly close to Soleil does.
Yes. A lot of the post-war architecture was very similar, and we've changed around our pulpit. It used to be a little high. It used to be somewhat different and we moved it towards the center, but yes.
I was thinking also that the Lutheran church stripped away so much of the, I don't know what to call it, the Catholic churches, the statuary, yes. The elaborate, stained glass windows and, just the, well, I guess they almost call it idolatry, at the time. And, I just think there was social pressure on the Jews of Germany trying to fit in, not just to make it look like the Lutheran church, but to make the ideology less, I don't really know how to put this. But I think you kind of, get the idea that we've stripped a lot of it bare.
Totally. I agree with, yes, that's good. Other comments? Yeah, Diane. Unmute.
Yeah, I would also say, and that is a form of criticism, that in Reform Judaism, the emphasis has definitely moved over to tikkun olam and study.
Sure.
As opposed to prayer. That, we say there are, three important things, and, prayer and acts of, kindness, whatever, tikkun olam. But the stress is definitely less on prayer, I think, and more on study and tikkun olam.
That's great. Good observation. Definitely true. In fact, that leads us to a related part of Heschell's speech. So I'm going to read that now. So it's up on the screen here, where it says the doctrine of agnosticism. The doctrine of agnosticism claims that prayer is rooted in superstition. It is one of humanity's greatest mistakes, a desperate effort of bewildered creatures to come to terms with surrounding mystery. Thus, prayer is a fraud. To the worshiping man, we must say, fool, why do you in vain beseech with childish prayers things which no day ever did bring, will bring, or could bring? Since it is dangerous fraud, the synagogue must be abolished. A vast number of people have indeed eliminated prayer from their lives. They made an end to that illusion. There are some people who believe that the only way to revitalize the synagogue is to minimize the importance of prayer and to convert the synagogue into a center. It is something which the Talmud characterizes as al shikron la'aron avon, hakodesh arnav al shikurin beit haKnesset beitam. I'll translate that in a minute. Let us face the situation. This is the law of life. Just as a man cannot live without a soul, Judaism cannot survive without God. Our soul withers without prayer. A synagogue in which men no longer aspire to prayer is not a compromise, but a defeat. perversion, not a concession. To pray with kavanah may be difficult. To pray without it is ludicrous. Woo! So what he's saying, so it's important to understand the historical context. So in the 1950s, I mean, it really started even before the 1950s, it started in the 20s and 30s, is there was this concept of the synagogue center. And that was like a shul with a pool is the best way of putting it. A shul with a pool. And there were the old Sinai in Hyde Park. There was a huge auditoriums, and it was meant to be kind of like a mini JCC. The synagogues were like JCCs. It was called a synagogue center. In Brooklyn, there's a synagogue, Beth Elohim, that still has a beautiful swimming pool. The idea was that in order to survive in the modern world, a synagogue can't just be a house of prayer and a house of study. It also has to be a true community center. And in 20th century America, a community center needs a pool. It needs a lecture hall and an auditorium for concerts and plays. It needs, sports fields. It needs all of that. And that's the only way that a synagogue can survive. And Heschell is criticizing this idea. And he says, that's it's like you're taking the most important part of the synagogue, which is prayer, and you're minimizing it. And in fact, it's the only thing that can truly ensure a synagogue in Judaism survives. This is the law of life. You can't lie. Everything depends on the Aron HaKodesh. That's essentially what he's saying. Everything depends on the holiness of the synagogue, on what happens in the sanctuary. And he's saying, if we give up on prayer, then we might as well give up on the whole enterprise. It's a pretty powerful criticism here. Yeah, Diane.
One of my very favorite prayers that we say on Saturday morning is written by Heschell. It's very short, so I'll just read it quickly, but I think it really sums up what he believes. Prayer invites God's presence to suffuse our spirits, God's will to prevail in our lives. Prayer may not bring water to parched fields, nor mend a broken bridge, nor rebuild a ruined city, but prayer can water an arid soul, mend a broken heart, rebuild a weakened will. And that's always been a favorite of mine.
Yeah, it's a beautiful prayer.
Yeah, it speaks to the importance, It's not just to ask for things. In fact, I don't think on Shabbat I think there's only one prayer, the prayer for peace, where we're actually asking for something for ourselves.
Yes, I say that. That's
Yeah.
one of the ways I like to teach that idea.
Right.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think this does have a lot of contemporary relevance. And what I'm going to say might sound controversial, but it's true. Our music at Macomb is beautiful, but we're never going to be as good as Ravinia. We're not. That's just how it is. That's the Chicago Symphony. These are musicians paid a lot of money, and that's their whole life. We cannot compete on a musical level with Ravinia. So if you really want a great concert, go to Ravinia. That's fine. But that's not what we're aiming for. Now, that's not an excuse for low standards. We're not going to have bad music. Like, that would be embarrassing. We're not going to have, it's not going to be dumbed down. It's going to be real high level learning and music, but we don't define ourselves as a performance. We define ourselves as a sacred community. And so and that's what makes, Ravinia is never going to try to have a worship service, although they have weddings there. I've done weddings at Ravinia and it's beautiful, but it is different it serves a different purpose. A synagogue is not a place to go to a concert. Although, you know, it can be, but that's not our primary focus. Our primary focus is becoming a home of God. It's prayer. So that is, I mean, really, that's the most important thing that happens is services, is worship, because you can't get that anywhere else. Well, I mean, you can have a worship service anywhere, but no space like a sanctuary. There's no other place like a sanctuary that is devoted to that kind of worship. I think that's what Heschell is saying here. You can't replace prayer with anything. And prayer is at the core of what we do. And like that prayer you said, Diane, that prayer that we read actually reminds us that prayer is part of so many other things. It's not like we pray just so we, it's not like we do responsive readings just so I can show you what a good voice I have and how I can read with great passion. I mean, it's great. I'm a good reader. Rabbi Ike's a good reader. Okay. But that's not why we read it. It's because the words can do more than just, they're more than just words. They have an impact. They can help us look at the world differently. They can remind us that we're part of a much longer line of tradition going back thousands of years. That's what prayer can do. And there's a power to that you can't, it's hard to capture. Other comments on this?
Rabbi, it's Jeffrey again.
Yes.
I have my oldest friend in the world is now a conservative rabbi. Changed after about 35 years. And he was with us where we were living somewhere else in a synagogue that we liked the people a lot, but we weren't thrilled with the service. But he was visiting, so we went to the services and we asked him candidly what he thought. And he said it wasn't spiritual. And in that one phrase, I think he captured exactly what our frustration has been. When you're at a place where there's not a participation mutually in the music and the song and the prayers and so on. And he said, from his point of view, because he made a decision late in life to become a rabbi, he was already 50, whether to study reform or conservative. And he was a very active social action lawyer, civil rights in the South, the whole thing. But he saw reform as mainly what he had been doing in social action. And it wasn't giving him what he wanted spiritually. And that was personal to him, but I think it captured part of this conundrum that we have in some Reform synagogues.
No question. No question. It's always been true. Yeah. For some people, Reform Judaism can feel like minimalist Judaism, and it can feel like it's not spiritual. Now, I think it's important to recognize too, that different people want different things. There's some people, I don't think there are many anymore, but there are some people who do love a concert-like service. Or, I grew up in Houston till I was 11, and we belonged to a synagogue there. And their cantor was extraordinary. He was extraordinary. He had an extraordinary voice. He had been a singer at the Met. And my mom, who was in the choir, my mom has a great voice and she loves singing, and she was blown away by the cantor. She loved going to services and just listening to him sing, and that was in some ways a spiritual experience for her. Now, she's not she doesn't feel that way anymore in a sense. And I don't think there are that many people who go to synagogue there's some. So part of the beauty of Jewish life is that you can kind of find, hopefully, not in every city, as kind of, Jeff, you talked about your experience. Sometimes it's hard to find, but in general, especially now with streaming and things like that, you can kind of find what you're looking for, and you can kind of have different styles. And Heschell is kind of saying, he's writing in the 1950s where there wasn't as much diversity of experience now, and so I think that is an important, there are people who would find our services, which I find very spiritual too. There are some people who would find there isn't enough participation. Like there are some people who would only feel comfortable in an Orthodox synagogue, oh, there's not enough Hebrew, so it's a beautiful thing that that there are an array of potential spiritual experiences. Yeah, Todd.
So just to tell you of a few experiences, so we streamed a lot of services during COVID, particularly from New York and LA and others. Got a good variety of rabbis, and of course we've attended conservative and reform, synagogues and temples over our lifetimes. I think that most people are looking to be inspired, however you define that. I mean, Heschell, of course, says prayer is song, for him at least. But I think most people are going to a service these days wanting to come out saying, I was somehow inspired, whether it's by the music, whether it's by the message, or what have you. But that's ultimately the key, I think, to a service is, does somebody feel inspired by that service? And I will tell you, again, I grew up in a classical reform where there was an organ, and the services were the Union Prayer Book and what have you, and not a very inspiring environment from my perspective, or from a lot of people's, which is, I think, why the reform movement moved away from that. I will tell you that the music that particularly that Macomb has and others, the guitar is much more inspiring. And that's true, much more inspiring than the conservative music, I will tell you, as a general rule. My wife and I have definitely found that. And I think there's just so much that reform has done with music. I mean, if you listen to, Ozzie Schwartz, who's the cantor at the conservative synagogue in New York, who's just a phenomenal cantor as a tenor. If you listen to what's going on at Sinai Temple in LA, what they do with music and what they do with the service, where Rabbi Wolpe just retired from. I mean, you'll see some really inspirational stuff that they've managed to come up with. And just to give you an idea, on one of the services that they had for High Holy Days a couple of years ago, they had the Platt brothers. And I don't know if you've heard this, but they've done a song, Ahavat Olam, which they did kind of in their, I don't know, their garage, whatever it was. And you can tell, you can go on the internet and see it. Just some of the most inspiring music I've heard, and that a lot of people have heard, and they did it themselves. And Ben Platt, as you know, is a Broadway star, but he and his brothers did that. And just some of the inspirational stuff that's being done around the country, I think it is great if people can kind of combine it into a service. But again, I think Orthodoxy, the philosophy is, there's a lot of ground to cover. God says you've got a duty to cover A, B, and C, and the structure has to be so. I think for non-Orthodoxy, people are looking for how to inspire themselves. And again, people do that different ways. But I think that has to be the emphasis, is how do people feel inspired by the service?
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a great point. And what's inspiring can differ depending on the generation and the context. Like, and for example, I'll confess something. I don't love using the projector, which we do sometimes during services, especially the kids are. I particularly don't like projector. I like a more natural way. And I actually think it is more, I think that's more fitting for a synagogue, because, a lot of people who, let's say you work as a lawyer or business executive or something, you're looking at PowerPoints and screens all day. Maybe when we come to synagogue, we want to get away from screen. In some ways, it should be in some ways different than the norm. And so I think that is in some ways, one way of being inspiring is to create a different kind of space, a space that's sort of harkens back to a more basic feeling of human connection. And I think that's important. And the inspiration factor, yeah, that's music. Music is so important. Like when I say about, we can't compete with Ravinia on music, that's on more of a technical level. But what a synagogue can do that's different is it can incorporate music as a form of prayer. And also it's participatory. Even at a place like Sinai Temple in Los Angeles or Park Avenue Synagogue, where the cantor is sort of the primary focus, people still do sing along. People do. And so there is a sense, but you don't see that in an opera. It's not like you're seeing La Boheme and everyone is, the lyric is singing along with that. That doesn't happen, So there is something still unique about worship that you can't get other places. And I think Heschell understood that. What Heschell would say is responsible for that. Heschell would say it's tradition, like in Fiddler on the Roof, tradition. Heschell would say the power of these traditions is enormous. And there's a power to saying words and prayers that we've said for thousands of years, that we may not even exactly understand what they mean, but because we've said them, because they're part of us in some mystical sense, we need to continue saying them. That's not all rational. Yeah. Other comments, questions?
One other comment about prayer, at least. If you actually look at the structure of our service, and particularly, if you go conservative and orthodox, a lot of our service is, a lot of doctrine is in our prayers. So the Amida, there are 19 blessings, there are all kinds of specific beliefs, which, Reform has rejected a lot of, unfortunately, in a lot of senses. So in Reform's Amida can be a lot shorter because, they're not so interested in, is the Messiah coming, is the temple being rebuilt and what have you. And so a lot of that's been filtered out. But I think it is interesting how much of our service, the Aleinu, is very theological type prayer, very much into monotheism and what have you. Shema obviously became a prayer. It's not a prayer, actually. It's not even supposed to be part of the service. It's supposed to be done when you get up and when you go to sleep, right? But we incorporated it in the service. Largely, of course, to rebut what was going on with Christianity, among other things. But I mean, there are a whole bunch of prayers and things that we do that actually have ideas to them that I think we could focus on as well. I mean, you can actually expand upon those as we're doing them during the service, and kind of expand the idea of, hey, this is what the prayer actually says in English, and here's what it means. I think that's the educational function of prayer, I think, is a very important one.
I absolutely agree. It's very, in some sense, prayer is a form of education. And you almost imbue certain doctrines, even if you don't quite understand it. It's part of the power of prayer. Sometimes it's a form of learning that is not purely cognitive. It's also emotional. Like when you hear the words of the Kol Nidre, I doubt many of us are analyzing it as a legal text, which it really is. I mean, it's a legal. I once went to a lecture when I was in Israel about like all the Jewish legal principles that were part of the Kol Nidre. It was a great lecture. I should find my notes for that. But I don't think most people are thinking that when they hear the Kol Nidre. They're thinking of the beautiful sound of the cello and the words and the attachment to it. So and yet we do kind of know that it's about vows and keeping vows and breaking vows. So it's a form of learning that's both cognitive and affective. It's both. Yeah. All right. Thank you, guys. This was great. And I will see you all soon.
Thanks so much, Rabbi.
Yeah, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.